Transport shuttle descended through the gray clouds surrounding forward base Arcturus, and David Kim pressed his face against the small window to get his first look at the training facility. The base sprawled across the barren moon surface like a metal fortress with towers and barracks connected by enclosed walkways. Dozens of ships sat in the landing zones, and David could see recruits from various alien species moving between buildings in organized formations. Shuttle touched down with a gentle thump and the boarding ramp extended. David grabbed his single duffel bag and joined the line of new arrivals filing out onto the landing pad. The artificial gravity felt slightly heavier than Earth standard, and the recycled air had a metallic taste that caught in his throat. Around him towered aliens of every description. There were the massive Korath with their 4 arms and rocky skin. The insectoid Chitauri clicked and chirped to each other in their native language. Even a few of the ethereal Lumina floated past with their translucent bodies glowing softly. David stood barely 6 feet tall and weighed maybe 180 pounds. Among these warriors, he looked like a child who had wandered into the wrong place. Bellow cut through the noise of the landing pad, and every recruit immediately snapped to attention. David followed suit as a figure approached from the main building. Sergeant Malik Torres stood 7 feet tall with scales that shimmered green and gold under the base lights. His reptilian face showed no emotion, but his amber eyes swept across the new arrivals with clear disdain. The Drath species had been warriors for thousands of years, and Torres wore his 3 rows of combat ribbons with obvious pride. The sergeant walked slowly down the line, inspecting each recruit. He stopped in front of a Korath and nodded approvingly. He paused before a Chitauri and tapped its armored carapace with one clawed finger. Then he reached David and stopped completely. Torres leaned down until his snout was inches from David's face. The sergeant smelled like hot sand and weapon oil. His forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air between them. "You are the human." "Yes." Sergeant Torres straightened up and looked David up and down with obvious disappointment. "Your species has sent exactly 7 recruits to this academy in the past 20 years. 6 of them washed out before completing basic training. The 7th died during a live fire exercise because he froze when he should have acted. Tell me, human, why should I waste my time on number 8? David kept his eyes forward and his voice level. "Because I am here to learn, Sergeant. We will see." Next 3 weeks blurred together in a haze of physical training, combat drills, and tactical simulations. David pushed himself to keep up with his alien squad mates, but the differences in biology were impossible to ignore. The Korath could lift 3 times what he could manage. The Chitauri had natural armor and lightning reflexes. Even the smallest aliens had advantages that millions of years of evolution on death worlds had granted them. Sergeant Torres seemed to take personal pleasure in highlighting these deficiencies. During endurance runs, he would pace David and point out how many recruits had already lapped him. In strength training, he would have David attempt the same weights as the Korath just to watch him fail. Every mistake was noted and every weakness was announced to the entire platoon. David endured it all without complaint. He arrived early to every formation and stayed late at the shooting range. When the other recruits went to the recreation facilities, David was in the gym or studying tactical manuals in the library. He spoke little and kept to himself. The other recruits began calling him Ghost because he seemed to drift through the base without making connections or friends. Some pitied him. Others simply ignored him. None of them took him seriously as a soldier. The first major combat simulation came at the end of the 3rd week. Sergeant Torres divided the platoon into 4 squads of 6 recruits each and assigned them a mission to secure a mock urban environment against AI-controlled enemy forces. David found himself assigned to 3rd Squad under the command of a Korath named Brick, who barely acknowledged his existence. The simulation began at dawn. 3rd Squad moved into the urban zone using standard coalition Tactics with the heavy troops in front and support personnel in the rear. David carried his standard pulse rifle and stayed in his assigned position at the back of the formation. Everything went wrong almost immediately. The enemy AI had been programmed to exploit standard tactics, and the defenders hit third squad with coordinated ambush from elevated positions. Brick ordered a frontal assault, but the narrow streets created fatal funneling points. Within 10 minutes half, the squad registered as casualties on their simulation armor. David found himself pinned behind a concrete barrier as simulated plasma bolts scorched the air above his head. He could see the enemy positions in the buildings ahead. He could see the perfect angle for a flanking approach through the alley to his left. He could see exactly how to use the burning vehicle for cover while repositioning to a better firing position. But Brick was still shouting orders to push forward, and David was a lowly private who had been at the academy for less than a month. So he stayed behind his barrier and fired ineffective, suppressing bursts until the simulation timer ran out, and third squad was declared eliminated. The platoon gathered in the briefing room where Sergeant Torres displayed the tactical feed from each squad on the main screen. First squad had taken their objective with minimal casualties. Second squad had fought to a stalemate. Fourth squad had secured half of their target zone. Third squad had been completely annihilated without achieving any objectives. Torres froze the feed at the moment when third squad had been pinned down. He zoomed in on David, crouched behind the concrete barrier. Private Kim, yes, Sergeant, you were in a perfect position to flank the enemy strong point. Why did you not take the initiative? I was following squad leader Brick's orders. Sergeant Torres' tail lashed back and forth in barely controlled anger. I do not care about following orders when following orders gets everyone killed. Out there, mercy gets everyone killed. Hesitation gets everyone killed. I do not care about your human sensibilities or your human weakness. When I put you in a combat situation, I expect ruthless execution of the mission parameters. I expect you to do whatever is necessary to achieve victory. Am I clear? David met the sergeant's eyes without flinching. Crystal clear. Sergeant Torres stared at him for a long moment, then dismissed the platoon with a disgusted wave of his hand. As the other recruits filed out, David remained standing at attention until the room emptied. Sergeant Torres gathered his data tablets and headed for the exit. He paused at the door and looked back at the human standing alone in the empty briefing room. You will wash out just like the others, David said. Nothing. He simply stood there in the dim light of the tactical displays with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression completely neutral. Torres left without another word. He had dealt with hundreds of recruits over his 15 years as a drill instructor, and he knew the signs of someone who was about to quit. The human would be gone within a week. They always were. What Sergeant Torres did not know was that David Kim was a third-generation military veteran whose grandfather had fought in Earth's last great war. What he did not know was that humans had spent 10,000 years learning how to kill other humans with ever-increasing efficiency. What he did not know was that human civilization was built on a foundation of carefully controlled violence that could be unleashed when necessary. And what Sergeant Torres definitely did not know was that he had just given David Kim permission to stop controlling it. The human remained standing in the empty briefing room long after the sergeant left. His expression never changed, but something cold and old and very, very dangerous stirred behind his eyes. The morning briefing began at exactly 0600 hours, and Sergeant Torres stood before the assembled platoon with a holographic display showing the layout of training Complex 7. The complex consisted of 12 buildings arranged in a grid pattern designed to simulate an occupied urban center. Somewhere inside those buildings, AI-controlled enemy units waited in ambush. Your mission is simple, Torres announced. Clear every building and neutralize all hostile targets. You will operate in your assigned squads. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. That means if it moves and is not one of your squad mates, you put it down. Hesitation equals death. Mercy equals mission failure. You have 4 hours to complete the objective. Third squad gathered their gear and performed weapons checks. Brick had been removed as squad leader after the disastrous first simulation and replaced with a Chitauri named Razor, whose armored body made her nearly immune to small arms fire. She regarded David with her multifaceted eyes and clicked something in her native language that the translator rendered as acceptable. The 6 members of Third Squad loaded into an armored transport that drove them to the edge of training. Complex 7. The buildings loomed against the artificial sky with darkened windows and empty streets, creating an eerie atmosphere. Razor deployed the squad in a standard formation, with herself and another Chitauri taking point, while the Korath provided heavy support and David, along with 2 Lumana, brought up the rear. They entered the first building through the main entrance and immediately encountered resistance. Simulated enemy troops opened fire from the second floor, and plasma bolts streaked down the stairwell. Razor charged forward with her natural armor, absorbing the hits while the rest of the squad provided covering fire. Within minutes, the first building was secured. The second building went similarly. Standard tactics worked because the enemy AI was following standard defensive patterns. Third Squad moved from room to room, clearing each space with overwhelming firepower. Then they reached Building 5 and everything changed. The enemy AI had adapted to their tactics and turned the building into a kill box. Razor pushed through the entrance and immediately took fire from 3 different angles. The Korath moved to support her, but triggered a simulated mine that eliminated him from the exercise. The 2 Lumana retreated to cover, but found themselves pinned by a machine gun nest on the 3rd floor. David did not advance with the others. He had stopped at the entrance and was studying the building with cold calculation. He could see the enemy had set up overlapping fields of fire that turned the main approach into a death trap. He could see the structural weak points where the building had been deliberately designed with tactical vulnerabilities. He could see exactly how to turn the enemy's advantages against them. Razor was shouting orders, but her voice was barely audible over the simulated weapons fire. David moved laterally along the building's exterior until he found a service entrance that led to the basement level. He entered alone. The basement was dark and filled with pipes and electrical conduits. David moved through it with his rifle raised and his eyes scanning for threats. He found the building's main power junction and used a breaching charge to destroy it. The lights throughout the building went dark in the sudden darkness. David activated his rifle's low light scope and began moving upward through the building. He encountered the first enemy unit on the 2nd floor. The AI-controlled defender was blind in the darkness and never saw David before a 3-round burst eliminated it from the exercise. David moved like a ghost through the darkened corridors. He did not rush. He did not make noise. He simply identified targets and eliminated them with mechanical efficiency. When he found the machine gun nest that had pinned his squad mates, he approached from behind and neutralized both defenders before they could react. On the 3rd floor, he discovered the enemy command post. 5 AI units were positioned around tactical displays, trying to coordinate their defense. David pulled a flashbang grenade from his kit and tossed it into the room. The simulation registered the blast, and all 5 units were eliminated simultaneously. The building went silent. David keyed his squad channel and spoke for the first time since the exercise began. Building 5 is clear. Razor and the surviving Lumia entered cautiously and found David standing alone in the command post, surrounded by neutralized enemy units. The Chitauri stared at him with her compound eyes, but said nothing. The pattern repeated through the rest of the complex. Whenever Third Squad encountered heavy resistance, David would slip away from the main force and attack from an unexpected angle. He used the environment itself as a weapon, finding ways to funnel enemies into ambush points or isolate them from their support elements. In Building 8, he triggered a simulated gas leak that forced the defenders to evacuate directly into his squad's fields of fire. In Building 10, he collapsed an interior stairwell to trap half the enemy force on the upper floors, while his squad eliminated the ground-level defenders. By the time the 4-hour limit expired, Third Squad had cleared all 12 buildings with 0 casualties. They had the highest completion rate and the fastest time of any squad in the platoon. The debriefing room was silent as Sergeant Torres played back the tactical feeds. The other squads had used standard coalition doctrine with varying degrees of success. First Squad had cleared 8 buildings. Second Squad had managed 9. Fourth Squad had taken heavy casualties and only completed 6 objectives. Then Torres displayed Third Squad's performance, and the room went very quiet. The feed showed David moving through Building 5 in the darkness. It showed him eliminating targets with cold precision. It showed him using the environment and the building's own design to create tactical advantages that should not have existed. Every movement was calculated. Every shot was placed with surgical accuracy. There was no hesitation. There was no mercy. Torres froze the feed on an image of David standing in the command post. The human's expression was completely calm. There was no anger or excitement or fear. He looked like someone performing a routine maintenance task. Private Kim, yes. Sergeant, explain your tactical choices in Building 5. David stood at attention and recited his reasoning with the same calm voice he always used. The enemy had established overlapping fields of fire covering the main approaches. Direct assault would result in unacceptable casualties. The building had vulnerable infrastructure, including centralized power systems. Eliminating power created a tactical advantage by denying the enemy their primary sensory input. From there, it was a matter of systematic room clearing using available low-light equipment. Torres' tail lashed slowly back and forth. You used demolitions to destroy civilian infrastructure. You created a hazardous environment with the gas leak in Building 8. You deliberately collapsed a stairwell that could have injured friendly forces. These tactics are— David interrupted him. Effective, Sergeant. The room went absolutely silent. No recruit interrupted a drill instructor ever. Torres' scales darkened with barely controlled fury, but when he spoke his voice was level. What did you say? You ordered us to neutralize all hostile targets without hesitation. You said mercy equals mission failure. I took you at your word, Sergeant. The mission was to clear the buildings. I cleared the buildings using the most efficient methods available. If the tactics seem extreme, it is because you demanded ruthless execution of mission parameters. Torres stared at the human for a long moment. Around the room, the other recruits were watching with expressions ranging from shock to horror. Even Razor had taken a step away from David. Dismissed. Torres finally said. The platoon filed out quickly, but David remained standing at attention. Sergeant Torres gathered his data tablets, but his hands were shaking slightly. He had trained thousands of warriors from dozens of species. He had seen aggression and violence and the chaos of combat. But he had never seen anything quite like the cold, methodical brutality that David Kim had displayed in those buildings. The human had not acted out of anger or fear or bloodlust. He had simply taken the orders he was given and executed them with absolute efficiency. There had been no hesitation, no doubt, no mercy, and that terrified Sergeant Torres far more than any enemy he had ever faced. Private "Kim, yes, Sergeant, you are dismissed," David saluted and left the briefing room. Torres stood alone, watching the frozen image of the human on the main display. For the first time in his 15-year career, as a drill instructor, Malik Torres wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that he had not trained a human to be ruthless. He had simply removed the restraints that humans placed on themselves. And now he was seeing what happened when those restraints came off. Sergeant Torres sat alone in his office long after the evening formation had dismissed. His personal terminal glowed in the darkness, displaying David Kim's service record. Torres had pulled files on problem recruits before, but this time he was looking for something different. He was looking for an explanation. The basic information was unremarkable. David Kim, age 23. Born in New Seattle on Earth. Standard education. No criminal record. Physical fitness scores were average for a human, which meant well below average for coalition military standards. Psychological evaluation showed normal range for all metrics. Nothing in the file suggested anything unusual. Torres dug deeper. He accessed David family history and found what the academy administrators had apparently overlooked or deliberately ignored. David's grandfather was named Michael Kim. He had served in Earth's military during what humans called the Last Great War. The conflict had lasted 7 years and involved every major nation on Earth. The casualty count was listed in the file, and Torres had to read it 3 times before he believed the number. 40 million dead on a single planet. In less than a decade, Torres pulled up the historical records that the coalition kept on pre-contact human conflicts. What he found made his scales itch with discomfort. Humans had been waging war against each other for their entire recorded history. They had started with rocks and clubs and gradually progressed to more efficient methods of killing. By the time they developed industrial technology, they had turned warfare into a science. The records described things Torres had no frame of reference for. Total war. The concept that entire populations were valid military targets. Humans had bombed each other's cities specifically to break civilian morale. They had burned farmlands to starve enemy nations. They had developed weapons designed purely to maximize suffering rather than achieve tactical objectives. Strategic bombing. Humans had built aircraft specifically to carry enough explosives to level entire city blocks. They had dropped incendiary weapons that created firestorms hot enough to melt glass. They had done this not to military targets, but to residential areas where families lived. Scorched earth. When retreating humans would destroy everything in their path, so advancing enemies would find only ruins and starvation. They would poison wells and burn crops and demolish infrastructure. The cruelty was methodical and deliberate. The Last Great War had been the culmination of this history. Humans had thrown 90 million soldiers into meat grinder battles, where thousands died for a few miles of worthless ground. They had used chemical weapons that dissolved lungs. They had perfected the art of killing each other on an industrial scale, and then they had stopped. The war had ended when humans finally looked at what they had done to each other and were horrified. They had built a global government specifically to prevent such conflicts from happening again. They had joined the Galactic Coalition with the explicit hope that their violent history could be left behind. Torres sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. David Kim was the grandson of a man who had fought in that nightmare. 3 generations removed, but the knowledge was still there, passed down through family history and military tradition. The next morning, Torres summoned David to his office. The human arrived exactly on time and stood at attention before the sergeant's desk. "Sit down, Private." David sat but maintained his rigid posture. Torres noticed that the human's hands were relaxed and his breathing was steady. There was no nervousness or apprehension. I pulled your family history. Yes, Sergeant, your grandfather fought in the last great war. He did, Sergeant. He served with the 3rd Marine Division in the Pacific Theater. He was awarded the Silver Star for actions during the Battle of Okinawa. Torres leaned forward. Tell me about that war. Private Kim David expression did not change. It was the largest armed conflict in human history. It involved more than 100 million military personnel from over 30 nations. Combat operations took place on 6 continents and across all major oceans. Estimated casualties range from 70 to 85 million, dead with roughly equal numbers of military and civilian losses. I read the statistics, Private. I want to know what it meant. For the first time, David's expression shifted slightly. It meant that humans learned we were very good at killing each other. We learned that when nations commit to total war, there are no civilians. Everyone becomes a target. Everything becomes a weapon. The only thing that matters is victory, because defeat means extinction. The Galactic Coalition does not fight that way, no, Sergeant, they do not. The Coalition fights with honor and restraint. They follow the accords of warfare. They distinguish between military and civilian targets. They take prisoners and treat them humanely. They fight to achieve political objectives rather than complete destruction of the enemy. And humans learn to do those things after the last great war, because we saw what happened when we did not. But before that, for 10,000 years, humans fought to exterminate each other. We developed tactics and strategies specifically designed to break the enemy's will to resist. We understood that warfare is not about honor or glory. It is about making the other side stop fighting by any means necessary. Taurus felt his spine ridge rise involuntarily. Is that what you think warfare is? Private David met his eyes without flinching. That is what warfare is, Sergeant. Everything else is just rules we invented to make ourselves feel better about it. Rules are good. Restraint is good. Civilization is good. But underneath all of that, humans remember what we are capable of when the rules come off. The office was silent for a long moment. Outside, Torres could hear the morning formation assembling and drill instructors barking orders. Normal military routine continuing like it always did. Why did you enlist Private Kim? My grandfather told me stories when I was young. He told me about the friends he lost. He told me about the things he saw. He told me that the worst part was not the fighting. The worst part was how easy it became. How normal it felt to do terrible things. He made me promise that if I ever served, I would remember that violence is a tool, not a solution. That the goal is not to win. The goal is to make sure the winning was worth what it cost. Torres leaned back in his chair. And what do you think I am teaching you? Here David did not hesitate. You are teaching me to remove restraints. You are teaching me that hesitation equals death. You are teaching me that mercy equals failure. You are telling me to be ruthless. That is not. David interrupted him again. You are a draft sergeant. Your species has been warriors for thousands of years. But you have always been warriors within your own cultural context. You have honor codes and warrior traditions. You understand when to fight and when to show mercy. That is built into your species at a fundamental level. And humans built civilization on top of 10,000 years of unrestricted tribal warfare. We invented agriculture so we could support armies. We invented writing so we could coordinate campaigns. We invented mathematics so we could calculate artillery trajectories. Everything humans created we eventually turned into a weapon. And then we spent the last 200 years trying to forget how good we got at using those weapons. Torres felt cold despite the climate-controlled office. What are you saying, Private? I am saying that when you told me to be ruthless, you did not train me to be something I was not. You gave me permission to remember something my species spent generations trying to suppress. You told me to stop thinking like a civilized human and start thinking like my ancestors. and my ancestors were very, very good at warfare. The sergeant stood and walked to his window overlooking the training grounds. Dozens of recruits were running obstacle courses and practicing combat drills. They looked enthusiastic and eager. They looked like young people playing at being warriors. David Kim stood and waited at attention. He looked calm and patient. He looked like someone who understood exactly what he was. "You are dismissed," Private David saluted and left the office. Torres remained at the window, watching the morning training continue. For the first time in 15 years, he questioned whether he knew what he was doing. Sergeant Malik Torres had thought he was molding weak recruits into strong warriors. He had thought he was teaching them to overcome fear and hesitation. He had thought he understood what ruthlessness meant. Now he realized he had been wrong. He had not created a warrior. He had removed the safety protocols from something dangerous and told it to operate without restraint. And he had absolutely no idea how to put those restraints back on. The alarm cut through the night cycle at forward base Arcturus, with a harsh electronic wail that sent every recruit scrambling from their bunks. David was already awake and dressed when the lights snapped on. Around him, his squad mates were pulling on gear and grabbing weapons with expressions ranging from confusion to panic. "This is not a drill." The announcement came through every speaker in the barracks complex, and suddenly the scrambling became more urgent. Razor appeared in the doorway of the squad bay with her armored carapace already sealed and her weapon systems active. Third squad form up. "We have hostiles on the perimeter." David grabbed his rifle and fell into formation with the others. They moved quickly through the corridors toward the armory, where Sergeant Torres was coordinating the defense. The Drath was barking orders into his communication system while tactical displays showed red markers spreading across the base's outer defensive line. Vrex Scout Force. Approximately 40 hostiles breached the eastern perimeter. All training squads will deploy to defensive positions and hold until reinforcements arrive from the main garrison. The Vrex were the reason the Galactic Coalition maintained forward base Arcturus. They were a species that existed only for expansion and conquest. They did not negotiate or take prisoners. They simply consumed everything in their path and moved on to the next target. The Coalition had been fighting them for 30 years with limited success. David followed Third Squad to their assigned defensive position on the eastern side of the base. The position consisted of fortified bunkers overlooking an open approach zone where enemy forces would have to cross exposed ground to reach the main facilities. It was good defensive terrain, assuming the attackers came from the expected direction. The first Vrex appeared at the edge of the sensor range, moving in organized groups. They looked like a nightmare combination of insect and reptile, with 6 legs and armored shells that could deflect small arms fire. Their weapons were biological launching acid projectiles that could eat through Coalition armor. Razor deployed Third Squad along the bunker line with overlapping fields of fire. The Korath handled the heavy weapons, while the Lumina provided electronic warfare support. David took a position on the left flank where he had a clear view of the entire approach. The Vrex attacked with typical ferocity, charging directly at the defensive positions while laying down suppressing fire. Coalition forces responded with concentrated volleys that cut down the first wave, but more enemies kept coming. The defensive line held, but David could see the problem. Immediately, the Vrex were probing the defenses looking for weak points. They were not trying to break through yet. They were gathering intelligence for the real assault. David keyed his squad channel. "They are testing us. The main attack will come from a different angle." Razor clicked something irritated. "Maintain your position and follow orders." The Vrex pulled back after 15 minutes of probing attacks. The Coalition defenders congratulated themselves on holding the line. David watched the sensor displays and counted the enemy units that had retreated. The numbers did not match. At least 20 wrecks were unaccounted for. He switched to Sergeant Torres' command channel. "We have enemy units missing from the count. They are flanking." Torres' voice came back sharp. "Maintain radio discipline, Private Kim." 10 minutes later, explosions ripped through the northern defensive positions where the base fuel storage tanks were located. The wrecks had circled around and hit the weakest point in the perimeter. Fires erupted across the compound, and suddenly coalition forces were fighting in two directions. Sergeant Torres was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a defense that was rapidly collapsing. Squads were being pulled from their positions to plug gaps in the line. The wrecks were inside the base perimeter and moving toward the command center. David watched it all unfold with cold clarity. He could see exactly what was going to happen. The coalition would commit all their forces to protecting the command center. The wrecks would use that concentration to isolate and destroy smaller units. The base would fall within 2 hours. He keyed the command channel again. "Sergeant Torres, I request permission to implement an alternative defensive strategy." There was a long pause filled with weapons fire and screaming. Then Torres' voice came back. "What strategy, Private? Sacrifice the outer facilities and create a kill zone around the command center. Use the fuel fires to funnel enemy movement. Collapse the connecting walkways to limit their approach vectors. Turn their numbers against them." Another pause. "Do it." David began issuing orders on the squad channel. He directed 3rd Squad to fall back from their positions and move toward the command center. Other squads received similar orders through Sergeant Torres. The coalition forces abandoned the outer defensive line and consolidated around the center of the base. The wrecks took the bait and poured into the abandoned areas. They spread throughout the fuel depot and the training facilities, thinking they had won. David waited until the enemy concentration reached critical mass, then keyed the detonation sequence. The fuel depot exploded with enough force to shake the entire base. Secondary explosions rippled outward as storage tanks detonated in sequence. The fires created walls of flame that channeled the surviving wrecks into narrow corridors between buildings. David had already positioned 3rd Squad and 2 other units along those corridors with overlapping fields of fire. When the wrecks came through confused and disorganized, they ran directly into a kill zone where concentrated fire cut them down in groups. The connecting walkways were next. David used breaching charges to collapse 3 of the 5 main walkways that led to the command center. The wrecks could only approach from 2 directions now, and coalition heavy weapons covered both approaches. The battle turned into a slaughter. The wrecks had superior numbers, but they were funneled into predetermined kill zones where massed firepower eliminated them efficiently. Every tactical advantage they had gained by penetrating the perimeter became a liability as they found themselves trapped in burning corridors with no room to maneuver. 30 minutes after David took control of the defense, the last wrecks unit was neutralized. The base was on fire and half the facilities were destroyed, but the enemy was defeated in coalition. Casualties were minimal. Sergeant Torres stood in the command center watching the tactical displays. Update with damage reports. Fuel depot destroyed. Training complex 7 destroyed. Barracks 3 heavily damaged. Recreation facilities destroyed. 5 defensive bunkers destroyed. The list went on. David appeared at the command center entrance with his rifle still smoking and his armor scorched from heat. His expression was calm. Mission complete, Sergeant. Enemy force eliminated. Friendly casualties at 11%. Critical facilities secured. Torres stared at him. You destroyed half the base. I preserved the command structure and minimized friendly casualties. The outer facilities were expendable. The fuel depot was already compromised. I used available resources to create tactical advantages. You deliberately collapsed infrastructure. You turned our own fuel into a weapon that killed dozens of enemy units. You sacrificed terrain we were ordered to defend. David did not blink. You approved the strategy, Sergeant. The command center was silent except for the crackle of fires burning outside. Every officer present was staring at David with expressions ranging from shock to horror. This human recruit had just orchestrated a defense that violated every principle of coalition military doctrine. Torres' scales darkened. Did you consider that some of those facilities could have been retaken, no, Sergeant? Retaking lost ground costs lives. Destroying it costs material. Material can be replaced, and if I had not approved your strategy, then I would have followed standard doctrine and we would have lost the base within 2 hours with estimated 70% casualties among defending forces. Torres wanted to argue, but the numbers on the tactical display supported David's assessment. The wrecks had breached the perimeter with superior numbers and momentum. Standard defensive doctrine would have led to exactly the outcome David described. The human had won by refusing to fight the battle the coalition way. He had won by fighting like a human. You are dismissed, Private Kim. David saluted and left. Behind him, the command center staff began coordinating damage control and reinforcement arrivals. Sergeant Torres remained standing before the tactical displays, watching the red markers that indicated destroyed facilities. He had asked for ruthlessness, and David had delivered. The base was saved, but the cost in material and the cold calculation behind the victory left Torres feeling sick. A young Lumina officer approached hesitantly. Sergeant, the private actions were within mission parameters. He achieved the objective with minimal casualties. Torres did not turn around. I know. Then why do you look troubled? Because I told him to win without hesitation. I told him to show no mercy. I told him to execute the mission by any means necessary. And he took me at my word. He fought like a human from before they learned restraint. The Lumina did not understand. Is that not what you wanted? Torres finally turned to look at the officer. I wanted a soldier. What I got was something far more dangerous. I got a human who remembers how his species used to fight wars. And now I have no idea how to make him stop. The Tribunal chamber on Coalition High Command Station Titan was designed to intimidate. The ceiling arched 30 feet overhead with viewing galleries where observers could watch proceedings. 7 judges sat behind an elevated bench representing 7 different species. At the center of it all stood a small platform where David Kim waited at. Attention! He had been standing there for 3 hours, while various officers presented evidence and argued about his actions during the Rex attack on forward base Arcturus. David had said nothing. He simply stood and listened as his tactical decisions were analyzed and debated by beings who had never seen combat. Sergeant Torres sat in the witness section feeling increasingly angry. They were treating this like a court-martial when they should have been awarding David a medal. The human had saved the base and minimized casualties. But coalition doctrine was clear. Destruction of friendly facilities was unacceptable. Sacrificing terrain was unacceptable. Fighting with the kind of ruthless efficiency David had displayed was unacceptable. The head judge was an elderly Korath named Stonebreaker, who had served in the coalition military for 50 years. He reviewed the final damage report, then looked down at David. Private Kim, you destroyed approximately 40% of forward base Arcturus, including critical infrastructure that will take months to rebuild. You deliberately used base fuel reserves as weapons, resulting in environmental damage that will require extensive remediation. Your tactical decisions prioritized enemy elimination over preservation of coalition assets. How do you justify these actions? David spoke clearly. The base was lost using standard defensive doctrine. I implemented an alternative strategy that preserved the command structure and minimized friendly casualties. Material assets can be replaced. Trained personnel cannot. You violated the accords of Warfare by using civilian-rated infrastructure as weapons. There are no civilians in a military base. Honored judge. Every facility present was a valid military target by definition. I used available resources to achieve the mission objective. Stonebreaker leaned forward. You seem to misunderstand the nature of coalition military service, Private. We do not fight to simply win. We fight with honor and restraint. We fight in a manner consistent with our values. Your tactics were brutal and excessive. My tactics were effective. The chamber went silent. Several judges looked shocked that a recruit would argue with a tribunal. Stonebreaker's scales shifted to a darker color, indicating anger. David continued before anyone could respond. The coalition has been fighting the Vrex for 30 years. In that time, you have lost 237 bases. You have suffered approximately 8 million military casualties. You have ceded 12 star systems. And you have achieved no strategic victories that change the course of the war. You will remain silent. Why? Because the truth is uncomfortable. You fight with honor against an enemy that does not understand honor. You show restraint against an enemy that shows none. You follow the accords of warfare while the Vrex exterminate entire species. How is that working for you? Sergeant Torres stood up in the witness section. With respect to the tribunal, the private has a point. Stonebreaker glared at him. Sergeant, you will sit down. Torres did not sit. I trained Private Kim. I told him to be ruthless. I told him to execute missions without hesitation or mercy. I gave him those orders because I thought that was how you win wars. He took my orders seriously. He fought the way humans fought before they joined the coalition. And he won. One of the other judges spoke up. A female Lumana named Crystal Song, who specialized in military ethics. The methods humans used in their pre-contact wars were horrific. We cannot adopt those tactics without losing what makes us civilized. David turned to face her. Honored judge, my species fought itself for 10,000 years. We developed every possible method of warfare from Stone Age brutality to industrial-scale slaughter. We learned that unrestricted warfare leads to mutual destruction. That is why humans created the accords of warfare in the first place. Not because we did not know how to fight without rules. Because we knew exactly what happened when we fought without rules and we wanted to stop. Then, why are you advocating for brutal tactics? Now, because the Vrex do not care about the accords. They do not care about honor or restraint. They care about conquest. The coalition can either adapt to that reality or continue losing slowly for another 30 years until the Vrex consume everything. The tribunal chamber erupted in argument. Judges were talking over each other while observers in the gallery shouted opinions. Stonebreaker called for order, but it took several minutes before the chamber quieted. The head judge looked exhausted. Private Kim, what exactly are you proposing? David's voice remained calm. I am proposing that the coalition creates a new training program. Teach soldiers when to follow the accords and when to set them aside. Teach them how to fight like humans fought when survival was the only thing that mattered. But also teach them when to stop. My grandfather told me the hardest part of war is not learning how to kill. It is learning when to stop killing. The coalition needs soldiers who understand both. That is a dangerous path, more dangerous than extinction. The Vrex will not stop. They cannot be negotiated with or contained. They can only be defeated. And defeating them requires tactics you currently consider unacceptable. Stonebreaker was silent for a long time. Finally, he looked at the other judges. We will deliberate. The tribunal recessed, and David was escorted to a waiting room. Sergeant Torres joined him, and they sat in silence for several minutes. That was either very brave or very stupid. Private. David allowed himself a small smile. My grandfather used to say those two things are often the same. 4 hours later, the tribunal reconvened. David stood at attention while Stonebreaker read the verdict. This tribunal finds that Private David Kim acted within the scope of his orders as issued by his commanding officer during a combat situation. While his tactics were unconventional, they were effective and achieved the mission objective with minimal friendly casualties. Therefore, Private Kim is cleared of all charges. The chamber erupted in mixed reactions. Some observers cheered while others looked angry. Stonebreaker raised his hand for silence. However, this tribunal recognizes that Private Kim's actions raise serious questions about coalition military doctrine and training methods. Therefore, we are implementing the following changes. The head judge looked directly at David. Private Kim, you are hereby promoted to the rank of instructor and assigned to develop a new training program. This program will teach coalition forces alternative tactical approaches for situations where conventional doctrine proves insufficient. Sergeant Malik Torres will serve as your liaison and cultural advisor. Torres looked stunned. Honored Judge, I am not qualified to you trained. Private Kim, that makes you the most qualified draft in the coalition to understand what you unleashed. You will work with him to ensure this new doctrine is implemented responsibly. David saluted. Understood, honored Judge. Stonebreaker looked tired. We are taking a tremendous risk with this decision. If you abuse this authority or train soldiers to become mindless killers, the consequences will be severe. Do you understand? Yes, honored Judge. My grandfather made me promise something before I enlisted. He made me promise that if I ever taught others about warfare, I would teach them not just how to win, but also how to live with what it costs to win. The tribunal was dismissed, and David left the chamber with Torres following. They walked through the corridors of the command station in silence until they reached an observation deck overlooking the shipyards below. Torres finally spoke. You planned this from the beginning. No, Sergeant. I planned to serve honorably and follow orders. You were the one who told me to be ruthless. You were the one who demanded I execute missions without hesitation. I simply took you at your word and showed you what that actually means. And now, I have to help you teach it to others. David looked at him. You asked me once why I enlisted. My grandfather told me stories about the last great war. He told me about friends who came home broken because they had done things they could not forget. He told me the real enemy is not the species you fight. The real enemy is becoming so good at violence that you forget how to be anything else. That is what I will teach. How to be a warrior when necessary, but also how to stop being a warrior when the war is over. Torres thought about that. It is a fine line, the finest. But humans have walked it before. We can teach others to walk it too. 3 months later, David stood before his first class of recruits. They were volunteers from various species who had requested this new training program. Some looked eager. Some looked nervous. All of them were about to learn something the coalition had spent decades trying to avoid. David looked at the assembled recruits and asked the question that would begin their training. Do any of you know what your species gave up to become civilized? Silence. You gave up the capacity for unlimited violence. You gave up the willingness to do anything necessary to survive. You developed honor codes and warrior traditions and rules of engagement. These things are good. They make you better than your enemies. But they also make you vulnerable to enemies who do not share those values. A Chitauri raised one leg. Are you saying we should abandon our values? No. I am saying you need to understand what exists underneath your value.